Hello there, and welcome back to Daddy Roll the One. I'm Martin, and this is another in my series of videos on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. And the company that published them, Tactical Studies Rules, later known as its descendant company, TSR Hobbies. This is going to be part one of a video specifically talking about the history of alignment and planes, or planar cosmology, in Dungeons & Dragons. And it's really impossible to separate talking about one without talking about the other. The two concepts of alignment and planes are so intermixed that they really need to be discussed together to understand how they influenced the game that we still play today in 5th edition, and still has a lot of these concepts that were developed in the very, very early stages of the game in the first few decades. So in order to get started, we need to do a little bit of history, of course. So we're going to start in 1969 with this game called The War of the Empires. So this was a play-by-mail war game of science fiction genre that was monitored by Gary Gygax. So just a quick version of a play-by-mail game. It's like playing on a message board or something like that we would have done in the early days of the internet. It's just done by mail. You're literally writing your moves down in a letter and you're mailing it off. And then those moves are being interpreted by someone else who is then, helping to help your opponent figure out how to respond and write back and forth. So that was 1969. And part of this game is that it mentions that your units or your troops should affiliate themselves with different parties or factions in the game. And it mentions names like the Free Spheres Party or the Federal League. It also mentions that your units and troops can be unaligned. So those terms might sound a little bit familiar, but let's get into 1971. So this is going to be much more specific to the D&D game. This is Chainmail Rules for Medieval Miniatures, written by Gary Gygax with his friend Jeff Parent. So this is a war game. It's not a role-playing game. But is a war game for playing, fantasy miniature or medieval miniatures war games. However, there's a fantasy supplement that Gary Gygax writes. And the idea was that rather than reenacting an historical battle, you could reenact battles from Tolkien, or it mentions here like Robert E. Howard, who's the author of the Conan stories. Or you could create your own world, he puts it in quotes, and create a fantasy game. And so he gives you the tools to do that, halflings and sprites and dwarves, goblins, elves, and talks about how to run a medieval miniatures war games, but using these fantasy type creatures. And in the back of this section, he mentions the general lineup. And it says, it is impossible to draw a distinct line between good and evil fantasy figures. 3 categories are listed below as a general guide for the wargamer designing orders of battle involving fantastic creatures. And then he has 3 columns: law, neutral, and chaos. So why is Gary doing this? Why is this general lineup in here with law, neutral, and chaos? It's because in a fantasy game, because you're not reenacting an historical game or an historical event, you don't necessarily know which side these creatures are on. So unlike a game like Leipzig, Battle of Nations, that was a war game that was a Napoleonic war game, or Gettysburg, American Civil War, or there's Normandy, the invasion of Europe, 1944. These are all examples of war games that would have been played shortly before Gary invented Chainmail. And this idea of you have these historical games, which side the 2 sides are on, or, who your sides are. In the American Civil War, you're going to be the Union or you're going to be the Confederacy. And if it's World War II, you're going to be the Allies or you're going to be the Axis. And you're not going to get British troops from World War II aligning themselves and allying themselves with Nazis. That's not going to happen. But in a fantasy game, you've got these list of creatures, and you might not even know what some of these things are. If you've never read Tolkien, you might not know what an orc is. We take it for granted now, but back then, that wasn't common use of that word. People didn't use that word. So Gary is creating these tables to show you which creatures align with which other creatures, so that the person running the game would know, well, if I'm on this side, if I'm on the side of law, these are the other units that I can have on my side that are going to fight with me against units of chaos or even units of neutrality, right? And then the units of neutrality might decide to ally themselves with law or with chaos. It kind of just depends. So that was the point of including this. And that's why you see with the release of Dungeons and Dragons in 1974, the game's not called a role-playing game. It's called Rules for Fantastic Medieval War Games Campaigns. So this is coming out of a war game tradition, and it is a role-playing game, but that term didn't exist during that time. And this is being based on what they had the context to understand what they were creating, right? So as it gets into the rules for creating your characters, which is in volume 1 here, Men in Magic, it mentions after the classes, this section right here. Character alignment, including various monsters and creatures. Before the game begins, it is not only necessary to select a role or a class, but it is also necessary to determine what stance the character will take: law, neutrality, or chaos. And then it provides these 3 tables here with creatures in each one. So that's key. It's a stance. This wasn't supposed to be a personality. This wasn't supposed to describe how your character was going to act. It was supposed to define how your character allied themselves or aligned themselves, hence the word alignment, with these different forces of, they're almost like, natural forces of the universe, law and chaos, right? And it's coming out of these books that Gary Gygax read when he was a kid or a young man. Specifically, you can look at this one here, 3 Hearts and 3 Lions, and this quote that is about the forces of law and chaos. And then, so this is written by Paul Anderson, and this really influenced this idea of alignment in Dungeons and Dragons. You also have later on another author, Michael Moorcock, who writes the stories of Elric, and starts in 1961 with a short story written in a magazine called The Dreaming City. Later on becomes novellas and then full-blown novels. So here's a quote from one of the 2005 books in the series. That's how long the series has been running. But it's talking about this concept of law and chaos, and that's in there all the way at the very beginning. So Gary used that as his way of deciding how people were going to align versus using this axis of good and evil. However, the unfortunate part is, because he doesn't ever define it, as you saw this table, he doesn't tell you what alignment is. It barely uses the word. It does say alignment once, and then it says just determine what stance your character is going to take, and then that's it. It doesn't even tell you what these things are, and it just lists creatures that are here. So if you see, evil high priests are listed under chaos. So are orcs, ogres, vampires. Okay, creatures that we would normally associate with being evil. And then creatures like unicorns and pegasi and elves, creatures that we would normally associate with being good. So unfortunately, this becomes a shorthand for players that don't understand, maybe haven't read Paul Anderson, they hadn't read Moorcock, and they didn't understand what Gary was getting at when he talked about this, right? Also, you'll notice in the monster book here, this is volume 2 of the 3-book set, there are no demons or devils or any kind of what we would call planar creatures in this book. And in volume 3, the Underworld and Wilderness Adventures, in the table of contents, you see it talks about the underworld and the wilderness, and it talks about land combat, aerial combat, and naval combat. It never talks about planar adventuring. That doesn't even come up. Okay, so that's 1974. So the planes aren't really a huge part of that at the time, but very quickly that changes with the release of this book, 1975. This is Greyhawk Supplement 1. And in this book, there is a spell. It's a 9th level spell. Astral spell. And it says, a spell which allows the user to send his astral form undetectable to all but others on the astral plane from his body to other places. So it starts developing this concept of like, there's another plane out there called the astral plane. It doesn't get any more detail in here, but it is part of this supplement. And so now, because of that spell, the astral plane is part of Dungeons and Dragons, starting with in 1975. So just a year after the game had come out. 1976, we get 3 key moments that are going to happen in the game. And the first off is the release of Eldritch Wizardry. 1976, this is Supplement 3 to Dungeons & Dragons. And in the Monsters and Treasures section on page 27, we see the first debut of demons in the game. So it lists the different types of demons, 1 through 4. It lists Succubi, type 5 and 6, Orcus, and Demogorgon. Okay, and then in the section on demons here, it mentions that they're chaotic and evil, but it leads with chaos. And it talks about how if they're killed in combat, their form is going to be forced back to the plane from whence it originally came. So it doesn't tell you what that plane is, but the implication is they're not from the world that we're from. And so if you kill them, they're going to go back to where they originated from. So it's, again, you're starting to see this development of the planar cosmology of D&D with the release of this. You also have the release of this book in 1976, Supplement 4, Gods, Demigods, and Heroes. This is a book of pantheons, or gods that your characters can worship. These are mostly earth-based pantheons. So you see there's Celtic in here, there's Greek. However, what do we know about the Greek gods? Well, we know that they live on Olympus, right? So this doesn't get into any of that. But the implication is there. We know that demons don't come from our world because they can be sent back from where they came. So that would also imply that the gods have their own places where they would live. And that's in this book. Another key moment in 1976 is the release of an article in the Strategic Review. This was a magazine published by TSR, and it's the precursor to what would then later be known as Dragon Magazine. But in issue number 6, Gary Gygax writes an article called The Meaning of Law and Chaos in Dungeons and Dragons and Their Relationship to Good and Evil. And this is the first map of the planes. But more importantly in this, or just as important in this, is that Gary mentions that had he been able to do it over again, he would have rewritten the alignment section in Dungeons and Dragons and in Greyhawk, because he didn't necessarily equate law with good and chaos with evil, but he does mention that that's the implication someone could take because of the way that he wrote it. Later, he backtracks and said he never meant that. But he kind of goes back and forth, which is very typical of the way Gygax writes. But he specifically mentions that in his mind, he knew that a lawful creature could be either good or evil, and so could a chaotic creature. And so he has this diagram for the first time where you're seeing him get into this concept past the 3 alignments of law, neutrality, and chaos, and into sort of like now a 5-point system. So lawful good, lawful evil, neutral, chaotic good, chaotic evil. And then he describes all these planes in this chart here. And so this is going to be our first planar map that we see for the game of D&D, where he talks about heaven, not the 7 heavens, but heaven. He talks about paradise, Elysium, not the 9 hells, but just hell, Hades, and not the 666 layers of the abyss, just the abyss. He also mentions nirvana and limbo, but this is really, while he's got these different areas mapped out, this is really sort of a 5-point alignment system. That's what the core of this article about. And that alignment system ends up making its way into the 1977 release of the Holmes Basic D&D Edition. You're going to want to watch my video on the history of D&D editions if you don't know what this is. But this is basically a concurrent game that's going to be running alongside what is eventually going to be called Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. There's a diversion, and there's 2 different versions of the game that are published concurrently for over 20 years. And in this particular version of the game, Holmes writes about character alignment, and he uses that 5-point system. And this is the only version of the game where in the official rules, it's a 5-point system. So it's lawful, it's good, it's neutral, it's chaotic, and it's evil. And he has a version of a map of the planes and the alignment graph that is very similar to the one that we saw in that previous article in the Strategic Review by Gary. But this is kind of its own thing. And the basic D&D cosmology from this point forward is going to be a little bit different. It's based in this concept, but it is going to be different. And from now on, we're not going to talk about that one. We're going to be talking about Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and focusing on that. So in Dragon issue number 8, this is a watershed moment in the history of cosmology of D&D. Gary Gygax writes this article wherein he maps out the planes, and he names each one of them and gives details on who lives there and what alignments those different planes are aligned with, how they're next to each other, and gets really into what is going to become the 9-point alignment system that we're going to get in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So interestingly, the 1977 Monster Manual doesn't use the 9-point system. It uses the Holmes 5-point system. There's no neutral evil or neutral good or lawful neutral or chaotic neutral creatures in the Monster Manual, except I believe it's the Displacer Beast that's listed as being neutral. And in parentheses afterward, it says evil. But other than that, it uses that 5-point system because the 9-point system hadn't been created when Gary Gygax was writing the Monster Manual. However, he does create it in 1977 with this article in Dragon issue number 8. And you'll see that article then comes forward here in the player's handbook, So this is 1978, and he takes that article, and in the appendix, you see there's a character alignment graph where he's got the 9-point alignment system that we're used to. And then he has these charts and graphs that talk about the planes of existence, and he maps them out here for us. So that is the first official version of what is now known as the Great Wheel. This lasted in D&D through the 3.5 edition in 2003, and then 2008, fourth edition kind of backtracked, and they did their own version of the Planar Cosmology. But then that later in fifth edition, they go back to the Great Wheel, but it does incorporate a lot of the stuff that was in fourth edition as well. But it mainly is based on this Planar Cosmology that we saw here. Okay, then in 1980, there's an article written in Dragon number 42 on the inner planes. And that is quickly followed in 1981 by in Dragon number 47, an article on what they called the other planes. And then in 1982, this is a key moment. This is an article in Dragon magazine number 67 by Roger Moore, not that Roger Moore, but a different one that wrote for Dragon magazine and worked for TSR for many, many years. And he writes what is now known as the definitive article on the Astral Plane that still impacts how we view the Astral Plane today in D&D. And this was written back in 1982. That article is followed in 1983 by an article in Dragon number 73 by Gary Gygax, again on the inner planes, where he also introduces the idea of the quasi-planes. And then you get Dragon number 75 and 76, a two-part series on the 9 Hells. This is written by Ed Greenwood of Forgotten Realms fame. And he writes, just like Roger Moore wrote the definitive version of the Astral Plane, he writes the definitive version of the 9 Hells. So all these articles are important because what's going to happen in 1987 is we're going to see the release of this book, Manual of the Planes. This is one of the last, it's the third to the last book published for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons before what we now call second edition Dungeons & Dragons came out. So this is by Jeff Grubb. And this book includes, it's all just about adventuring in the plane. And if you see in the very front here, it mentions to Ed Greenwood, who produced the definitive dissertation on the 9 Hells, to Roger Moore, whose equally definitive articles on the Astral Plane form the foundation of that section. There's other people that they thank in here, but those two particular articles right there are key to this book. So we're going to talk about this book more in part 2, and I'm going to go through it in detail. Just as a fun aside, I got this book because when I did my video on the history of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons first edition hardbacks, this is the only book that I didn't have. And I published that video, and I mentioned in the video that I didn't have it, and if anybody had an extra copy lying around, if they wanted to send it to me. And lo and behold, I'm not going to mention his name, but a very kind person on Reddit saw that and messaged me and said that he had gotten, he'd lucked out and he'd gotten an extra copy. There was someone's name written in it. It's not his name. But other than that, it's in fantastic shape. And he offered to send it to me just for shipping. So kindness abounds, and I was overwhelmed with his generosity. But I loved getting this book because this completes my collection of all the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons first edition hardback books. So that's it for today. Again, we're going to dive into this in part 2 of the video on planes and alignment in D&D. I hope you enjoyed this, looking at alignment maybe a little bit differently. A lot of people maybe not know about the 3-point alignment system. But if you did like this video, if you could please like and subscribe to my channel. And also, most importantly, if you could please share it on your social media. That's the best way for me to grow my channel. Please leave me a comment below. Let me know what you liked or didn't like. And then lastly, if you'd like to support me, I don't have a Patreon or a Coffee or anything like that. The best way that you can support me to help me keep making more videos is by buying a little something in my shop. There's a link below where you can buy t-shirts or mugs or anything like that with exclusive designs. So with that, I'll say goodbye, and I will speak with you next time. Thank you.